Okay, aloha everybody. Thank you guys all for joining us for our weekly Hanauma Talks presented by the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College Program, Hanauma Bay Education Program. Today I have Dr. Melanie Hutchinson, and she'll be talking about working with industry to improve post-release survival of sharks incidentally captured in commercial fisheries. So without further ado, Melanie.
All right, thanks so much, Gavin. And thank you for those of you who join us and make it through this presentation. Start with a little background information and a little bit of information about myself and why I was asked to give this presentation today. So I started out as a fisheries observer in 2006, working in the Hawaii longline fleets, swordfish and tuna sectors. And I, during that experience, became kind of interested in the bycatch problems that we were seeing in that fishery, particularly with sharks. So I decided to pursue some research and a graduate degree and then a career in bycatch, and somehow ended up mostly focusing on sharks. So with this talk, I want to talk a little bit about my research. And then, but to start, I'll start with regional management because it's kind of weird and nuanced, and I'll talk a little bit about it. So I'll give you a little background on that. And then the biology of sharks and why they're vulnerable to overfishing. And then we'll talk about the three fisheries around the Pacific that are interacting with sharks at a high rate, and the projects and the research that we have in these three fisheries, starting with the longline and then purse seine. I'll tell you a little bit about the operations and the research that we're actually conducting. And then if there's time, we can talk about some of the smaller scale tuna fisheries around Hawaii, and one of our big projects that I have a lot of fun with working with the fishermen. And then we'll talk about what we can do as consumers to reduce the impact of fishing on pelagic shark populations. So to begin, let's start with the management overview. So in the United States, each coastal state regulates what happens in their waters. But then beyond that, there are regional fishery management councils. And in the United States, we have 8. And the one that is specific to us is the Westpac. So that is Hawaii and the US territories. And these are all mandated with upholding and meeting the criteria that's laid out under the Magnuson-Stevenson Fishery Conservation Act. And this is the main law that the United States has that governs fishing in US federal waters. So this ranges from 3 miles out to 200 miles offshore. And that is the United States exclusive economic zone. But then beyond that are, because we are working with highly migratory species that might be moving across the Pacific Ocean, we have to manage these shared resources collaboratively with other countries that are also fishing on the same populations. So in the Pacific Ocean, there are 2. This is the Western Central Pacific Fisheries Commission on the western half of the Pacific Ocean. And then on the eastern side, we have the Inter-American Tropical Tuna Commission. And so they have, every nation that fishes in these waters has a voice in these commissions, and they all assess the populations that they're fishing on and then come up with collaborative management tools. And so they also must manage the species that are interacting in these fisheries. And so these fisheries typically target tuna, but a lot of times there are other species that are captured as bycatch, so namely sharks. And so there are several conservation and management measures that have been laid out in these commissions that all of the nations that fish in the waters must abide by. And so for sharks specifically, oceanic whitetip and silky sharks, there are retention bans in place. The management measures also state that sharks must be released in a manner that minimizes injury. And there's also some data requirements and encouragement for all of the fishing nations to work on bycatch mitigation and release guidelines that will maximize post-release survival. So that's kind of the area that I work in. But I have to at least mention why sharks are a little bit more vulnerable to overfishing than some of the target teleost species. So those are the broadcast spawners that can give off millions of offspring every year. So the targets are typically tuna and swordfish. But sharks, they have life history characteristics that are a little bit more like our own. They're long-lived, they have slow growth, late ages at maturity, and small litter sizes. So they can't replenish themselves very quickly. There's also high juvenile mortality, and characteristically, sharks have always kind of regulated their own population structure, where large sharks, the largest component of their diet in most species is other sharks. So the impact of fishing on these populations has been a little bit devastating for some. And several of them have been assessed as overfished. So there are 3 factors that have the largest effect on post-release survivability. And these are typically the physiology. So these are species specific, where some species are a little bit more resilient to the impacts of a fishing interaction, whereas some don't make it at all. And we know what these are because of the at-vessel conditions. So if there's a high proportion of the animals that come up alive, then we know that they're a little bit more robust, whereas some, like hammerhead sharks, are typically, they don't do well on lines. So usually the higher proportion are dead when you get to them. But then there's also the nature of the interaction. So this would then be fishery specific. So the impacts of a small trawler versus a longliner versus a purse seiner, those are all going to be different effects and have different impacts on post-release survival rates. But then the low-hanging fruit for people like myself that are trying to improve the situation for sharks is the handling and discard methods. So this seems to be a good way for us to identify potential solutions to some of the bycatch issues and then make really good recommendations to some of the fleets on ways to improve their practices. So again, relative impact by fishing modality is not only just because of the nature of the interaction, but also because of effort. So this figure shows relative impacts to oceanic whitetips, where purse seiners contribute about 16% mortality, while longliners about 51% of the total mortality on a global scale. Gillnets are kind of small, and then 25% from other fisheries. So these would be like the smaller scale artisanal fleets. So this brings us to our first fishery that we're going to talk about. This is the Hawaii Longline fleet. Here's some of our vessels at Pier 38. So this fleet, if you're not familiar with the operations, they roll out this long line. This is the main line right here, and attach branch lines to it. So the branch lines have a snap that attached to the main line, and then this long branch line here, a weighted swivel in the tuna sector, and then this is a leader to a hook. And these can be like 15 to 17 meters long, depending on the fleet. And they will roll out about 25 to 50 miles of mainline and then intermittently attach snaps and branch lines to that, and that's interspersed by floats. So this is kind of what it looks like if you were looking at it from underwater. So the floats keep the line at the surface, and then that way the vessel can kind of control the depth at which the hooks are fishing. Our Pacific fleet has 3 sectors. The U.S. fishery, we have a deep set sector, and that's targeting tuna, and they're stationed in Hawaii. There's also a shallow set sector, and that is targeting swordfish. And then we also have a small fleet in American Samoa that also targets tuna, and all three of them have kind of different gear characteristics. But essentially, they are interacting with sharks, but about 98% of the sharks are discarded. So it's bycatch, and they are incidental interactions, and then they're returned to the sea. And so when we started looking into some of the bycatch issues with sharks, we were curious about handling, and then also post-release survival rates. And we wanted to identify the handling methods that would improve post-release survivorship. And so we started asking the fisheries observers to collect some information about the animals at the vessel, their condition, the handling, whether or not there was any damage that to the animals because of the handling, and then what their release condition was as well. And then we also asked the animal or the observers to record the amount of trailing gear that was left on the sharks when they were discarded. Because what we learned was that around 93% of the sharks that were released by just cutting the line. And so essentially what the fishers are doing is when they bring the main line back in to haul in their catch, when they see a shark to release it, they were just kind of cutting the line somewhere along here, typically at the snap, to release the animal. So that means that the animal has differing gear types and lengths of trailing gear still attached to it on release. In the American Samoa tuna sector, the boats are a little bit smaller, and they get the animals a little bit closer to the vessel before they cut the line. And the average is about 3 meters of monofilament that are left on the animal, while in Hawaii, they were cutting it a little bit closer to the snaps, and the branch lines are also a little bit longer. So that meant that there was about 9 meters on average. But then also this fishery has this weighted swivel gear requirement to reduce seabird bycatch. So these sharks are also released with a wire leader, weighted swivel, and then a length of monofilament branch line. So what we wanted to know was what was the post-release fate of these animals that were released with this trailing gear. And so what we did was ask the observers to place satellite tags on the animals so that we could get a quantitative estimate of what was occurring after the interaction. And so the satellite tags that we were using, they are called pop-off archival tags. You can see a nice big eye thresher here with the little tag in its back. These tags, they are programmed for a certain deployment period, and they have several onboard sensors. So they record information about the temperature of the water column, the depth. There's a pressure sensor. They have light level sensors, so we get light level information, and we can recreate where the animal went horizontally. And then there's also an onboard clock. So we get a really cool vertical picture of what the animal was doing post-release. And then when the tag reaches its pre-programmed deployment period, it initiates a little burn right here. And then the tag floats to the surface and then starts transmitting all of the data that it stored to the overhead satellite array that have Argos receivers on them. And then those all get dumped to a processing station, and then we get an email of the tag data. So then we can recreate what the animal is doing, all kinds of habitat use information, but also the fate of the animal and where it went. So we worked with the Pacific Island Regional Observer Program, and we trained them to tag the sharks while they were still in the water. So it's actually a really difficult maneuver to do. And so we have a whole bunch of observers that were trained to do this. And then they were recording some specific information about the interaction, gear characteristics, handling. But then they were also kind of educating the fishers about what they were doing and talking to them about the project and how handling may impact survivorship. And this was also totally voluntary by our fleet. So we would, when an observer was assigned a boat, we would go down to the vessel, talk to the captain and the crew, tell them what the tagging interaction was going to be like. And then we would ask the observers to tag maybe 3 sharks during the trip. And the captains were all super excited about the project. Well, not all of them, but most of them. And the crew loved it. They were all very, very helpful. So it's been a really cool collaborative project to improve handling practices. So we were tagging 4 different species. These are key species. So 4 of the species that are managed by U.S. federal management entities like Westpac, but also the international RFMOs. So we had 224 tags that went out on blue sharks, oceanic whitetips, silky sharks, and big eye threshers. And what we learned was that survival rates were actually really high, higher than expected for sharks that were in good condition at the vessel, about 93%. And then this here is a survival curve. So this is survivorship over time in a percentage, and then time over here. And so in the short term, survivorship was really high, but over time, survival rates were dropping to about 60% after 180 days. And what we also learned was that the largest impacts on survivorship probabilities were the handling. So whether or not the vessel did something to remove the gear, like some of them will actually bring the animals on board and try to get the gear out, and then some will just cut the line. And so what we found was that the animals that were left in the water had higher survivorship. So if the line was cut and the animals were left in the water, but then beyond that, survivorship dropped off over time for sharks that were released with longer lengths of trailing gear. So if the trailing gear was longer than 2.5 meters, survivorship was much lower than if it was shorter than 2.5 meters. And so what this means is that we can make really good quantitative recommendations or recommendations to managers that are actually based on data. And for the fishers to make small changes in their handling practices to drastically reduce the impact of longline fishing on some of these key shark species. So this has been a really satisfying project, and a lot of our recommendations for handling are being implemented at the global RFMO level. So this work is all based on the US fleet, and I'm really proud of our everybody that was involved, because it was the observer program, it was the fishers, it was the stakeholders, it was the scientists and the managers. So it's been a really cool collaboration. So next we can talk about the purse seine fleet. The purse seine fishery is unique. It doesn't happen around here, so I don't think that very many people are familiar with this type of fishery. It is an important fleet because it delivers more than 50% of the world's tuna to the market. And fun fact, about 82% of all tuna is consumed from a can, and this is the fishery that delivers tuna to the canneries. So this is the U.S. purse seine fleet in American Samoa. Do a couple fishing operations slides so I can tell you how it all goes down. So the vessels are huge, and they have a small skiff, like relatively small. These things are actually kind of massive. This is like a 250-foot vessel or something like that. And they have this huge net stacked on the back of the seiner. And when they find a school, so they have people up here that are on these massive binoculars out looking for tuna schools. When they find a school, what they'll do is drive this skiff off the back of the vessel, and it's dragging the net off the back of the vessel. and the seiner will encircle the school. So they encircle the school, and then at the base of this net is a heavy chain. And so what they'll do is essentially like pull the chain. So that's why it's called a purse seine, because it's kind of like purse strings. So they encapsulate the entire school. And then they just start restacking the net. So they'll bring the net in closer and closer. And then whatever's inside, it gets smaller and smaller. And then this is called sacking up. So they kind of pull the bottom of the net up so it just gets tighter and tighter right at the side of the vessel. And this is called the sack here. So this is all the fish right next to the vessel. And then they bring it all on board with the use of a giant dip net. I think you can put like 8 metric tons of fish in these things. So it'll drop down into the sack and then bring all of the fish on board. Some vessels have this thing, something like this, some version of a sorting tray. So on this vessel, they call it a hopper. Here's a hydraulic little trap door here. So they'll dump the catch in here, sort all the bycatch, and then let it go into a system of chutes. And then these are all below decks. So they'll build chutes and then run a super cooled brine solution through the chutes and then straight into refrigerated holds. So it's really efficient, super effective. And to increase increase catch per unit effort and decrease search times, so increase efficiency, a lot of these vessels fish on something called fish aggregating devices. Or fads, we call them fads. And these are drifting fads. So this is what the top looks like. It's just some bamboo, some net, a couple floats. And then a lot of them will have a tail, but they'll also have this little thing here. So this thing is a solar powered sonar buoy that has GPS capabilities, and the vessel can track where it is. And then because it has sonar capabilities, the vessel will know what the biomass is underneath the fad. So they can very effectively plot out their fishing endeavors. So you see a school over there, it's like, okay, we'll go check out the school, but maybe these fads are better options for today because we know exactly what the biomass is under the fads. And for some reason, a lot of animals aggregate at floating objects in the open ocean. So a lot of the target species you will find held in dense schools around these floating objects. But also silky sharks for some reason, specifically juvenile silky sharks love these things. And they make up, so this is the tail that I was talking about. So this is what it looks like underwater. Tails sometimes are like 150 feet, sometimes a little bit deeper. So yeah, juvenile silky sharks, they get entangled in these, but they also aggregate at them. And as a result, they comprise about 90% of the shark bycatch for fat-associated sets in the purse seine fishery. And silky shark bycatch rates are twice as high in the fat-associated sets than they are on the free school sets if they just see the fish jumping out in the open ocean. But there are also several concerns for mobula and whale sharks in these fisheries. So we'll talk about those 3 species. So the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation has really cool partnerships with industry and have done this thing called the Global Bycatch Project, where they picked scientists from every ocean and then placed them on purse seine vessels to have a collaborative solution and discussion to come up with some bycatch solutions. So not only for shark bycatch, but for undersized big eye and some other species as well. And so this work has been conducted in every ocean. And this is a component of my PhD, is that we specifically wanted to know, when do silky sharks die and what are the post-release survival rates? So we use the same tag types and tagged animals that were captured in a bunch of different stages of the fishing operation. And then we also did blood draws. so that we could get some really good quantitative estimates of survivorship. And we found that there were some stress related parameters that you could find in the blood that correlated really closely with survivorship, which we measured using the tags. So lactate was the thing that came out as the best predictor of survivorship. And what we found was that the big parameter that had the largest impact on whether or not an animal was going to survive was at what point in the fishing operation the animals were landed. So we tagged sharks while they were still inside the net and free swimming, and then released them outside the net, and had 100% survival rates for those. And then a lot of sharks will come up actually entangled in the net, so they get landed onto the vessel before it's in that sack. And they had pretty good survival rates, about 68%. And then anything that came up in that big old braille had a much lower post-release survival rate. And so some of the key conclusions, so this is what it looks like actually. I have a little video here of some silky sharks at the end of the sacking up procedure. And essentially what it shows is that when the net starts getting smaller, as soon as they encounter the structure, like they've been in the open ocean, so they've never really seen anything before, is that they would hit it a couple times and then kind of slide to the bottom. And so essentially they were like stressing out and dying before it was even sacked up. So it actually didn't matter how big the catch was that day. The animals that came up later had really low survival probabilities. And so what we learned from this was that if we wanted to reduce the impact from this fishery on this population, is that we had to focus all energy and effort in getting the animals out of the net prior to sacking up, or focus a lot of energy and effort on avoidance. Oh, here we go. This is our video. So this isn't actually a really small set. So I think the catch was maybe 4 metric tons, but it can be well over 100. But a lot of the sharks, when they would encounter this catch here that's probably close to 40 metric tons. So as soon as they would encounter the net, they would just kind of sink to the bottom. So we've done quite a bit of work with all of our colleagues and collaborators in all the oceans to find different solutions to the bycatch issue for the silky sharks in this fleet. So a ton of tagging where we were trying to identify behaviors that you might be able to exploit to maybe like key in your fishing operation. Like maybe they departed from the fat at a certain time and the tuna were still there. But what we found with all this tagging was that essentially they leave at the same time that the tuna leave. They stay in association with the fad longer than tuna do. So there wasn't any sort of behavioral thing that we could exploit to reduce interactions with sharks and just target the target species. And we also learned that, essentially there was no silver bullet. And this figure shows the depth preferences of silky sharks in the western half of the Pacific Ocean. Here's the temperature preferences. So they have a very small temperature range. And then here's the thermocline of the water column here. And so essentially what they are doing is they're restricted to the upper mixed layers. And this here is the net depth. So there wasn't an escape for silky sharks vertically nor temporally. And so essentially our management option was to reduce FAD effort. And so that is what the WCPFC did, is they have a FAD closure for several months out of the year. And this was meant to reduce shark interactions, but also reduce undersized big eye tuna catch rates. Then I mentioned that sometimes whale sharks and mobula species are also encountered in this fishery. So whale sharks, there is a ban on setting around a whale shark because tuna will hang out under whale sharks. But a lot of times you can't see the whale shark prior to the sacking up phase. And so what has been implemented are a set of best handling and release practices. And so we've done some tagging to assess post-release survivorship and identify the handling practices that do indeed improve survival rates. And then same thing for mobula species. So here are a couple whale sharks that we captured in a per seine. Nobody saw them before we set the gear. They came up at the very end. And essentially what the fishers do is they roll the net out from underneath the animals and then they drop the corks. And so I tagged both of these whale sharks. They both survived. And the encounter rates are so low that it's really hard to get tags on these animals and get this kind of information. So there's a whole bunch of different international entities that have an effort to put a tag on whale sharks. And essentially, there's been about 41 whale sharks tagged, and survivorship, when the fishers release the animals using those best handling practices, is like 98%. So the best handling and release recommendations for whale sharks are working. So that's a good story. And then with mobula, same thing. Nobody knows anything about these taxa, and they are even more vulnerable to overfishing because of their life history characteristics than some of the other shark species. A lot of them will have only 1 or 2 pups, maybe every 3 years, and slower growth. So mortality to these populations is really impactful. So there's a lot of energy and effort to improve the situation when they're encountered. And so what we're finding is that these best handling practices that have been developed at the RFMO levels are not quite there yet. So essentially when these animals, because they're so massive, they're really unwieldy and hard to get back in the water. They end up on deck for longer than they ought to be, and the post-release mortality rates are quite high. So I tagged 6 mobula terrapecana on a recent trip, and only 1 of them survived. So survivorship rates for this species was about 17% to 60 days. So this is an ongoing effort with international collaborators in every single ocean. And so we're all working really hard to improve the situation for mobula. Also, what we're learning with all of this tagging information is that there are seasonal hotspots. So these things are aggregating for different biological imperatives. So there's feeding aggregations, and there's reproductive reasons for aggregations. There's nursery areas. And so identifying these hotspots is probably our best way of coming up with management solutions that will have the biggest effect. So future work is kind of focusing on creating more dynamic spatio-temporal avoidance measures. So look forward to that. And then what this all tells you is that I always put this slide in here because sometimes this is a good place for me to end my talks. But essentially, we're the consumers, and we're the ones that are wielding the dollar, and there's a lot of power in our dollars. And so we're the ones that are actually driving these fisheries. And so if we're demanding sustainable seafoods, then the market will deliver. So if we value fisheries that are ecologically friendly, then the fishermen will find ways to improve their practices. And so what I like to tell people when they ask me about fish to avoid is that the Monterey Bay Aquarium has a really cool app. It's called the Seafood Watch. And so you can download that, and I take it to restaurants and really irritate my servers when I'm like, oh, what species is it? Where's it from? Oh, that's on the red list. Sorry, I can't have that. You should tell your cook not to order this kind of fish. The NOAA also has a fish watch guide with smart seafoods, and there's all kinds of companies, one of which is awesome called Wild Planet. They deliver canned seafoods that are from pole and line fisheries, so they don't have fad captured tuna, and you can actually buy that at Costco. Okay, and then the next thing that I wanted to tell you guys about was some of the smaller scale fisheries around Hawaii. So this is where we can get our local seafood. So here we are, Hawaii, surrounded by tons of blue. So a lot of these highly migratory species that are racing across the entire Pacific Ocean, a lot of them like to make a little pit stop in the middle of the sea. And Hawaii is really unique, not only in the fact that it's the most isolated archipelago on Earth, but also it's like high islands with really, really interesting depth contours. So it goes from very, very deep to shallow really fast. So this drives a whole cool ecosystem that a lot of the pelagics that we need to manage and that are interacting with some of the other species, they all kind of come here and hang out at some point. So we've been working with some of the smaller scale fishers, mostly around Hawaii, but we're trying to expand our effort to the other islands, the island of Hawaii, expand our efforts to Oahu, Kauai, Maui, Nui, to put some tags on sharks and understand what the interaction rates are. So this is like typical small scale boats. They'll use some of the state run fads. Typically, a lot of these guys will change their fishing methods for whatever is biting. A lot of them bottom fish, a lot of them troll, some palawahi, some ikashibi, which is like a nighttime handline fishery. But as a result, they're targeting tuna and they're interacting with a lot of shark species. So we're catching blue sharks, big eye threshers, short-fin mako, silkies, oceanic white tips. But it's not always a pleasant interaction. These species are oftentimes depredating the catch. So they're having a pretty devastating impact on the fishers, like huge economic losses, not only to a fish that they would get, like sometimes these things are worth $1,000 a piece, but they also lose a lot of their gear, and the fish don't bite if there are sharks in the area, or else this happens before they can actually get the fish to the boat. So a lot of times the interaction doesn't end well for the shark. And so what we're trying to do are understand first the habitat drivers, like what are the environmental drivers, but then also what are the interaction rates, what are the economic losses, and then help inform the fishers on different strategies of avoidance or maybe deterrence. And another complicating factor is that the oceanic whitetip has has been assessed for the second time since 2013 as overfished and in decline. And so on an international scale for the entire Pacific Ocean, but the United States recently listed the species as a global population under the United States Endangered Species Act. They were listed not as endangered, but as threatened, which comes with some unique ways of helping to mitigate the impact of U.S. fishers on these populations. And so the ESA is meant to provide protection for species that are threatened with extinction throughout a portion of their range, which means that we need to work with fishermen on finding strategies that will reduce the impact that they're having on the population. So we came up with this community tagging program. It was a community tagging program, but also a social study. And one of my colleagues and friends, Mia Iwane, she generated a whole bunch of interviews of a bunch of different fishermen to learn kind of about their ecological knowledge, but also better ways of coming up with outreach and education. Like what are the needs of the fishermen? And then with the tagging, we wanted to learn what their habitat use and behavior was like. So we had a whole bunch of objectives for this project that I've already mentioned. But essentially this study is ongoing. So we started out by having a whole bunch of tagging workshops, mostly on the Big Island, but we invited a bunch of the local fishers and their friends, went to their houses sometimes. Sometimes we would teach them how to do the tagging at the harbor. And then they would walk away with a tagging package and then provide us with a whole bunch of information on interactions. And then we had 3 different tag types that we gave to the fishers because we wanted information about depredation rates, interaction rates. And then during these workshops, because a lot of these guys don't know how to identify the species, we learned that we needed to come up with a comprehensive identification guide that was kind of specific to this fleet. So we created the offshore shark species identification guide, and handed out these little guides to these guys. And then a lot of the pages will have how to compare and identify the different species that they would typically interact with. And then they had little data sheets that they would fill out for their tagging interactions. And but we've had a pretty good effort over these last few years. It's been really informative. So far, we have about 63 different species that were captured during bycatch or incidental interactions with the identification tags. And then we've been putting out acoustic tags so that we could understand their residency times at the FADs. So residency, arrival, departure, whether or not these species have any sort of like real patterns in their behaviors that we could probably inform, hopefully not probably, inform the fishers about, like, if they show up at 5, stop fishing at 5, and they leave at 3, start fishing at 3, kind of a thing. And then the pop-off archival tags are teaching us a lot about how they utilize the vertical habitat, what the environmental drivers are, and whether or not they are resident population. So we have about 85 animals tagged with electronic tags to date, so significant effort. We have about 100 fishermen that are in our tagging program that have tagging packages. So it's been a lot of fun to work with the fishermen themselves and learn about what they know and get some information and good ideas. Give us horizontal range. We can see that a lot of the animals are kind of sticking around Hawaii, with some doing some longer distance migrations, but really interesting in that they're not visiting some of the other islands. So kind of unique resident behavior that we're seeing so far with some of the tags that have popped off already. And this is the acoustic array that we're monitoring with underwater receivers to understand FAD residency. So we have the north and east shores of Oahu monitored. These are the state FADs. This is what it looks like under the chain where our receivers are. And then the entire west side of the Big Island from north to south. And we are seeing evidence of residency. So a lot of these animals are visiting a whole bunch of the FADs, but they're showing up annually and interannually. And so the project started in 2017, headed to the Big Island next week to go do another receiver swap. So we'll get some more really interesting and exciting information. And this is detail that doesn't exist anywhere else. So this is it's been really cool. So the project, like I said, is ongoing. It's been an excellent model of collaborative research. The fishers are testing deterrents, giving us all kinds of ideas about different things that we can do to potentially reduce interaction rates and the impact that the sharks are having on the fishers economically. So if you'd like for more information or get involved, visit sharktagger.org, and then you can request a tagging packet or even just check out our shark identification guide and some of the other stuff that we work on. And then that brings us to the end. There's a whole bunch of people that have been involved in these tagging studies. I definitely didn't do it by myself, but all the fishers, all the support funding has come from the International Seafood Sustainability Foundation, the National Marine Fisheries Service Cooperative Research Program, NOAA's Bycatch Reduction Engineering Program, and the Salton Stall Kennedy Funding Program. ISSF. These are JIMAR and HIMB projects. And since you can't ask me questions directly today, here is my email address, melanier@hawaii.edu, or you can visit us at sharktagger.org to learn more about the project. So thank you for your attention, and stay safe.
And that's that. Yeah, thank you.
That's it.